So I wanted to do something a bit different today and try to keep it a little bit more simple and just quickly go over the ventilator screen itself, because I think that's one of the things that's probably the most intimidating with the ventilator is the screen and all the different numbers and what they all mean. So I think it'd be worthwhile to sort of go over. So if we start here, this is a Servo Mackay U ventilator, which is a pretty common ventilator, I think. A lot of places have it, but just sort of walking through, this is where you denote the mode. So what mode is it on? So this is on PRVC. As we know, PRVC is the worst mode of ventilation, sadly, but this is what the mode that was chosen was. All the different modes are here, which I think a lot of people probably won't be using these buttons because RT should be setting it. RT will be setting this stuff and probably wouldn't be touching this too much. So then here's other respiratory therapy, probably domain, which is alarm limits, sort of like all these different alarms. So the peak pressure alarm, the respiratory rate alarm, what's too high, what's too low, the minute ventilation alarm, what's too high, what's too low. So these are things where if these numbers fall out of these parameters, the vent will alarm. So it's important to know what the alarms are, because if you set this incredibly high, a lot of bad things can happen between a peak area pressure of 24. And if you set the alarm at 100, a lot of bad stuff can happen from a peak area pressure of 24 to a peak area pressure of 100. So knowing your alarms is important, or for respiratory therapy at least. So these are the maneuvers, which is where you're going to find your plateau pressure. So how to get your plateau pressure, which is your inspiratory hold, and then how to get your total PEEP, which is how we sort of derive auto PEEP. Here's views, which you can switch up the views or add in the PV loop or that kind of stuff. So then moving on to things that are probably more important for our everyday sort of learners and users is, so along the bottom here, you can sort of broadly characterize this as what we set and then what we measure. So first, to start with what we set, what are we setting? We're setting an FiO2, we're setting a PEEP, we're setting a respiratory rate, we're setting a tidal volume because this is PRVC, so we're setting a tidal volume. Some settings that are a little bit more advanced, probably not going to be for the everyday intern, resident, APP, even fellow, probably even attending to some degree. So this is your inspiratory time, because remember in PRVC, since it's a pressure mode, we're setting an inspiratory time. This is your rise time, so how fast you're going to rise, how fast the pressure will rise. So you can imagine sort of here versus going straight up. It's a little bit different of a rise time. So this rise time is 0.15 seconds, so how long it takes to sort of get to the peak. Then your triggering mechanism. So remember, you can trigger off of essentially three things, which is time. So if you have a certain rate and you divide that by 60, that's sort of your breath-to-breath time. So every certain amount of seconds, you're going to have a breath delivered, which is the controlled rate. You can trigger off of flow or pressure. So this is set to a flow trigger of 1.6. So all this is our set stuff. This is a button that you can press if the patient's hypoxic, and you hold it for about probably 1 to 2 seconds, and then it's sort of what you can watch it load, and then it'll deliver 100% oxygen for 2 minutes as you sort of like either get the patient suctioned or sedated or whatever it is. Sort of like a rescue maneuver. So this stuff is what we set. Now, what are we measuring? Because when you report this stuff out on rounds or RTs to the attendings or interns to the attendings or APPs to the attendings, like what are you sort of saying? So the best way to present this information would be sort of what we set, PRVC, set rate 15, total volume 470, set FiO2 50% or 0.5. Since it's a percent, some people are sort of pedantic about that. I don't care as much. Keep a 5. If you really wanted to impress me, you would throw in the I time as well, because the I time is important because it's one of the things that we set, and you would say I time of 0.9 seconds. Then what are we measuring? So with those settings, we're getting a peak airway pressure of 24, an actual respiratory rate, so peak airway pressure here, actual rate, what the patient's breathing, of 15, breathing with the ventilator, right? The set rate and the actual rate are the same. Now the question becomes, how do you know if the patient's triggering the vent? And it's a little bit different for all the different ventilators, but for the Servo Mackay, you'll see two things. The first thing you'll see is a little white line like right here. So if the patient's breathing and triggering, a little white line will pop up here. And then in the top right-hand corner, which is not here, a set of lungs will pop up, meaning that the patient's triggering the vent. So even though the patient's breathing 15, all those breaths are triggered, or some of them are triggered, or something to that extent. So noting like how the breaths are being triggered is important. Minute ventilation, not as important to report on rounds, although to be honest, I would like to know it because while it's easily figured out, it's just sort of respiratory rate times your total volume. It'd be nice to say out loud. I prefer it, but not everyone does. So if you did or didn't include that, that would be fine. So this is your mean airway pressure, which you don't have to report because it's not sort of a reportable data point, but is important nonetheless. This is your IDE ratio that the vent's going to calculate. This IDE is 1 to 3, which on rounds probably isn't as important. Your oxygen concentrations here, and then the last three things which are sort of important is, so what is your total volume in? So your inhaled volume, and then your exhaled volume, because remember, these things should be the same. And in PRBC, they should be whatever we set. So it should really be somewhere closer to 470 in, 470 out. This was with a test lung, so it wasn't like a real patient, so that's probably why it's a little bit different. And then lastly here, this ventilator spits out your dynamic compliance, which is a little bit different than your static compliance, but is important. It's a little bit different than your static compliance. It can be important, but not necessarily something to talk about every day on rounds. Although if you did include it, it would be a nice addition. The last three things, or two things at least, the last three things on the vent here. So up in this top right-hand corner. So if you press and hold this button, it'll take a 30-second recording of the ventilator screen 30 seconds before and then 30 seconds after you push it. Similarly, if you press this button, this is just to capture a screenshot of the vent itself, just in that sort of time frame. And then here is where you'll store all those images. This might be more useful for respiratory therapy, and I'll tell you specifically how. If the patient's failing in SBT and for tachypnea or something, it's much more powerful when you take a screenshot or a video of what the patient was doing on SBT, and then you can tell the attending or whoever, like, hey, the patient was tachypnic or they were not pulling big volumes, and I took a screenshot, and then you can show the screenshot to whoever, because how the waveform looks could impact maybe what you might do next to help the patient get off the ventilator. So this was a quick tour through just a regular vent screen, which I think is important because maybe it's not which I think is important because some might not go over it as in depth, but it is important, and we're expected to sort of like report these data points out. And if there's something wrong or something amiss with the ventilator, sort of where you should start. So these were the things that we were setting and measuring. In the next video, we'll go over not so much how to get peak and plateau pressure, although we can show you on this, but that's something that RT will most likely get. So that might be something you're getting from a computer, but we can talk about how they obtain it and then what it means sort of in the waveform. So we'll do that next time. Thanks.